From 41 floors up, New York looked like a living map. Avenues as neat as ruled paper, headlights stitched into obedient lines, bridges arching like ink strokes. Ethan Cole loved that view. It lied to him so beautifully. From up here, everything seemed orderly, inevitable, under control. None of it hinted that he was less than a month away from losing everything. He leaned on the frosted glass of the rooftop terrace of his Soho building, jacket slung over one arm, shirt sleeves rolled above tense forearms. The late summer air had that electric smell of hot metal and rain on the way. It should have been a relaxing evening, but his phone kept buzzing with a rhythm that felt like a countdown. Margin calls. 3 in a single minute. A leveraged credit line he once called temporary oxygen had turned into a plastic bag cinched tight around his company's throat. Turnstile, the app he'd built from nothing, had once promised to revolutionize small business payments. For years it had. Investors cheered, competitors lagged, and Ethan had felt invincible. But now interest payments, union lawsuits, and a suddenly ruthless rival were choking it. That rival's logo, once laughable, had started appearing on receipts from Ethan's biggest clients. He swiped his phone and saw the last message from his CFO. "We'll manage." It hadn't yet turned red. He didn't believe it anyway. Somewhere far below, a siren wailed toward the Hudson, cutting through the city's noise with bone-white clarity. Ethan remembered the last time he'd felt this dizzy, senior year, slamming headfirst into the hockey rink boards during a playoff game. Back then, he'd seen stars. Tonight, he saw only dots on a graph, falling hard. He opened his photos, stopping on a picture from Montauk last summer. His mother, widowed young, wearing her practical windbreaker. Dylan, his younger brother, squinting against the sun, hair a mess. Ethan himself, standing behind them, looking like the sort of man who believed nothing could touch him. Now that confidence felt like a receipt for a life he'd overpaid for. Wind rattled the terrace furniture, and the thump of a helicopter moving toward Midtown vibrated faintly in his chest. New York didn't care who stumbled, but it never forgot who fell. Ethan gripped the railing a little harder. For the first time in years, he couldn't tell if he was still climbing, or if he'd already begun to drop. The call came at 8:13 a.m., carrying the dry, clinical tone of a man asking if he could borrow a stapler. "Mr. Cole, the desk is asking if you'll post an additional 8 by close." $8 million, requested with the same casualness as a coffee refill. Ethan sat at his kitchen counter, staring at the untouched mug steaming beside him, the morning light slicing across marble that suddenly felt cold. His thumb tapped the phone as if extra movement could invent collateral. He dialed his CFO, and after 4 long rings, the man's voice slid through, slick, confident, and brittle. "It's transitory, E." The Fed's messaging shook software broadly. "We're fine." Ethan let out a sound halfway between a laugh and a groan. "Transitory like my patience," he said. He pulled up the numbers again, watching red arrows stab down his dashboard. That convertible note he'd used to buy out a noisy investor matured in 5 weeks. The insurance claim for the Yonkers warehouse fire, critical to their supply chain, was still under review. And now the class action lawsuit, sparked by a software glitch that double-charged customers, had been certified. What began as a minor bug had multiplied into a swarm of legal bills. At noon, the gut punch landed, his rival's press release. They'd just secured Metro Grocer, the contract Ethan had been chasing for 3 years. Pleased to partner. Those 3 words were enough to freeze half his sales pipeline. By mid-afternoon, 2 of his banks had sent polite but ominous notes about credit reassessment. Even his most loyal board member suggested exploring options, which everyone knew meant preparing a funeral speech. In the mirrored elevator ride down from a tense boardroom, Ethan barely recognized himself. Jaw tight, tie loose, eyes sharp but tired. The doors slid open to the lobby florist, the smell of roses and eucalyptus rushing in like a misplaced memory. It felt almost like stepping into a church. He wondered, absurdly, what one might send to a lender when you couldn't send money. Flowers? A prayer? A thank you card for their patience? The thought almost made him laugh, until he remembered patience had never been part of their business model. The city outside was bright and restless, moving at its usual brutal speed. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk and had the sudden, quiet realization that unless something changed fast, he'd soon be walking through it as a man without a company, without a plan, just another headline in the business section that people would skim over before moving on to sports. The past found him at a crosswalk on Houston Street. Cole. The voice cut through the horns and footsteps, warm but edged with surprise. He turned and saw her, Ava Morales. In high school, she'd been debate team captain, the sharpest mind in the room, and the only person who ever told Ethan he talked in headlines instead of arguments. Back then, they'd shared greasy pizza, bad coffee, and a promise that they'd never become the kind of people who used favors as currency. Now she stood in a navy jumpsuit, hair cut short, a canvas tote slung over her shoulder with the words "Build the City" stamped in bold letters. The city traffic swirled around them, but Ava seemed like she had all the time in the world. "I saw your name trending," she said, not unkindly. "You okay?" For a moment Ethan thought about bluffing, the way he had for reporters and board members. But Ava had always been immune to polish. Not remotely, he admitted. The light turned green. Neither of them moved. Cars flowed around like a stream, avoiding a stubborn rock. Finally, Ava tilted her head toward a coffee shop across the street. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the hiss of milk steamers. Rain tapped against the fogged glass. Ethan laid it out, the margin calls, the lawsuits, the rival's victory. Ava listened without interrupting, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. "You built a cathedral on scaffolding," she said finally. "It held until you started throwing a dance party on the second floor." He should have bristled. Instead, he felt something almost like relief. She wasn't pitying him, just naming the truth out loud. "Why are you being nice?" he asked. Ava smiled faintly. "Because I owe you for sophomore year." He frowned. "I don't remember." "Exactly. You pushed the school paper to run my story on the principal's slush fund. Cost you your after-hours computer lab access. You didn't ask me to pay you back." She sipped her coffee, then added, "Also, I like a good ruin. It's where the light gets in." Ethan wasn't sure if she meant his company or himself. Maybe both. Ava didn't waste time with pep talks. She asked for the documents. By late afternoon, they were standing at the narrow counter of a bodega on Avenue C, wedged between a jar of pickled eggs and a lottery terminal the owner blessed with 2 fingers before every shift. The smell of frying empanadas and overripe bananas hung in the air. Ethan pulled his laptop from his leather bag, the same one he'd carried into investor meetings back when he thought he was untouchable. Ava leaned over the spreadsheets with the concentration of a surgeon, highlighting debt covenants with a marker she'd taken from a jar labeled "No stealing." "Your core product's fine," she said, tapping a column that showed net retention above 90%. "The rots in the vanity limbs, your labs division, those acquisitions you made for press releases, that absurd podcast series. Who convinced you to be a brand instead of a business?" Ethan swallowed. "I did." The deeper she read, the worse it got. His CFO had quietly amended a loan provision that tied interest to an index that spiked the moment the Fed started hiking rates. The result? Turnstile's debt costs had tripled in months. "He turnstiled you," Ava said dryly. "Cute." Without asking, she pulled out her phone and called a friend at a community development financial institution in Queens. "You still rescuing salmon swimming upstream?" she asked. "I've got one flopping on my counter right now." In less than 10 minutes, she'd sketched a triage plan on the back of a receipt. Sell the rooftop and the Hamptons share, freeze hiring, protect payroll, call the biggest vendors as if they were family. "And the lawsuits?" Ethan asked. "We own them," Ava said. "You make a video admitting the glitch, offering refunds before the courts can force you. Humility's cheaper than discovery." A kid in a hoodie tugged her sleeve. "Ms. Morales, the website ate my shopping cart again." She promised to look at it tonight. Ethan realized she wasn't just a non-profit do-gooder. She was an operator who happened to have better manners. "Why are you really doing this?" he asked. Ava shrugged. "Because if you go under loud, people like him stop believing in anyone promising help. And because I hate watching old friends drown in water they poured themselves." They chose a Chrome diner off Route 3 where bus drivers and bond traders shared booths and pretended not to notice one another. Vinyl seats squeaked. A pie carousel turned like a lazy planet. On the TV above the counter, last night's football highlights played without sound, helmets colliding in beautiful, pointless loops. Ava arrived with 2 people, a lawyer with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. Mason, gray at the temples, eyes like leveled spirit bubbles, and a quiet woman from the Queen's lender, Priya, who handled papers as if the corners might cut. Ethan brought his CFO, Chase, whose cufflinks reflected the neon exactly like the eyes of something cornered. They ordered coffee and didn't touch it. Mason laid out the structure with the same patience a surgeon uses when explaining a necessary scar. Pre-packaged reorg, not liquidation. You keep the engine, we change the belts. Priya slid a thin term sheet across the table. A debtor in possession line from us, she said, modest but honest. Enough to pay staff and key vendors. In exchange, guardrails, weekly reporting, no more vanity spend, no sidecars. Chase tried to laugh. It came out like steam from a cracked pipe. We don't need training wheels. Ava didn't look at him. You amended the rate floor into a rocket. Maybe you need a seatbelt. Mason continued. Union Pension takes a slice of equity to swap out the ugliest tranche. Their members are your merchants. They want you alive, but not swaggering. Terms unfurled, unpretty but survivable. Executive comp capped. Rooftop and Hampton's share listed by Monday. An independent monitor. A restitution fund for double-charged customers. A public apology. Ethan would record himself. No PR gauze, just the wound and the stitching. Ethan felt the room tilt as if the diner had lifted onto two wheels. Pride screamed to walk. Reality said sign. He turned to Chase. Can we live with this? Chase's smile thinned. It's punitive. They're using the press cycle to mug us. He flicked at a clause. Weekly cash sweeps? Absurd. Priya's voice stayed gentle. Absurd as payroll bouncing. A waitress topped off cups that nobody lifted. Somewhere near the kitchen a bell dinged, and the smell of bacon swerved in like a memory of simpler problems. Ava spoke so quietly it made everyone lean in. Chase, about that index amendment. You filed the notice late. If I send this to the AG's office, they'll wonder who benefited. We don't have to make that call. Her eyes were calm. Help him fix, not hide. Chase stared, a beat too long. You're bluffing. Mason slid a printed email from the folder like a card at the river. Time-stamped. The booth felt suddenly smaller. Ethan looked at the man who'd ridden shotgun beside him for 3 years and saw, unhappily, a stranger. I'm signing, he said. He initialed every margin. When the pen hovered over the last line, his phone buzzed. Dylan, can we talk tonight? It's important. Another buzz followed from an unknown number. She's not what you think. Check who owns Build the City. Ethan pocketed the phone without reacting. He scrawled his name. The deal, fragile as spun sugar, was real. Priya exhaled. Lights stay on. Mason collected the papers. Now we go tell your storm that there's a plan. Ava finally lifted her coffee. Welcome back to Small, she said. It's where things survive. Ethan nodded, feeling the old floor under his feet again, thin, scarred, but his. Outside, trucks moaned along the highway, and the city glowed like a patient that might actually wake up. He didn't see Ava glance at her own buzzing screen, and he didn't ask. By Wednesday morning, the deal was public. A brief press release framed it as strategic restructuring and operational realignment. The business blogs called it turnstiles fall from grace. Ethan ignored them. Mostly. The team returned to the Soho office like soldiers after a retreat, alive, but limping. Payroll cleared, lights stayed on, but the mood had changed. The rooftop terrace was locked now, awaiting valuation. Half the marketing team's desks were empty, chairs pushed in as if their owners might still return. Ava arrived without announcement, carrying 2 paper cups of coffee and a tablet already buzzing with emails. She moved through the office like she owned none of it, yet understood all of it. First vendor calls at 10. You'll take it, not Chase, she said, handing him a list. The apology video is at 1. And tonight, we go over who stays and who goes. He followed her to the small glass-walled conference room they'd turned into a war room. The whiteboard was covered in her handwriting, columns labeled critical, salvageable, dead weight. Seeing the names in ink made Ethan's stomach tighten. You always this ruthless? He asked. No, Ava said, flipping through a file. But survival isn't polite. By noon, Ethan had spoken to 3 major vendors. 2 were cautiously on board. The third wanted cash up front for the next 2 shipments. Ava leaned in during the call, scribbling negotiate partial prepay on a yellow sticky note and sliding it toward him. At 1 o'clock, The camera was set up in a small office they'd cleared. Ethan stood before a plain backdrop. No company logos, no filters. The first take came out stiff. Ava stepped forward. Forget shareholders. Talk to the baker in Queens who used your app and got charged twice. Talk to your mother. Talk to Dylan. He nodded. The second take was different. Voice lower, no script, eyes direct. When it was done, Ava said, "That one." By evening, the war room was littered with coffee cups and printouts. A storm was moving in outside, the glass panels rattling in their frames. They worked until the rain hit hard, pounding against the city like impatient knuckles. As they packed up, Ethan's phone lit again. "Dylan, still need to talk. Urgent." Then, moments later, the same unknown number from the diner. "You didn't check." Ava's not a savior. Build the city is a shell. Ethan slid the phone into his pocket. He didn't know whether to laugh, worry, or ignore it. For now, there were too many fires in front of him to go hunting shadows behind. But shadows had a way of waiting. It was after 9 when Ethan finally left the office. The rain had washed the city into a blur, streetlights bleeding into puddles, storefronts glowing behind streaked glass. His driver was off, so he walked, collar up, the warm paper bag of takeout under his arm leaking the smell of sesame and ginger. Dylan was waiting outside his apartment building, hood pulled up, leaning against the brick like he'd been there a while. "You don't answer calls anymore," he said, voice carrying that mix of teasing and worry older siblings never quite lose. "I've been a little busy keeping my company from catching fire," Ethan said, swiping them inside. In the apartment, Dylan peeled off his damp hoodie and sat at the counter. He looked older than Ethan remembered, less from years than from something heavy sitting on his shoulders. "It's about Ava," he said, without preamble. Ethan set the takeout down, the lids fogging. "What about her? She's not just running that nonprofit. Build the City's registered to a holding company in Delaware, one that's been buying up distressed tech assets for pennies. A shell with clean PR." Dylan slid a folded printout across the counter. "And guess who chairs it? Victor Lang." Ethan stared at the name. Lang, his first investor, his first betrayal. The man who'd nearly sold Turnstile to his current rival 2 years ago. "You're sure?" Ethan asked. Dylan tapped the paper. "Lang's fingerprints are all over it. I think Ava's the front. You sign enough of those term sheets. She's holding the leash, but he's the one pulling." Ethan exhaled, leaning back against the counter. "She pulled me out of a hole. Or deeper into one," Dylan said. "Sometimes a rescue boat just takes you where they want you." The smell of food filled the room, but neither touched it. The rain outside softened, turning to a thin hiss against the windows. Ethan's mind replayed every moment from the past week. The coffee shop, the bodega, the diner, the war room. Ava's focus, her quick phone calls, the way she'd known exactly which vendor to call first. It all fit too neatly. Dylan stood, pulling his hood back on. "You wanted to know what was urgent. Now you know." At the door, he added, "Just remember who threw you the rope, and who's holding the other end." When Ethan was alone, he poured himself a glass of water he didn't drink. His phone buzzed, a message from Ava, "Big win tomorrow. Don't stay up late worrying." He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over the reply. In the glass reflection, he caught his own face, somewhere between gratitude and suspicion. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the office before the cleaning crew had finished. The air smelled faintly of industrial lemon, and the hum of the espresso machine was the only other sound. He sat at his desk, Dylan's printout spread in front of him, tracing every connection like lines in a spiderweb. Lang's name appeared just far enough down the chain to stay hidden, but once you knew where to look, the trail was there. By 9, the war room was alive again. Ava swept in with her tablet, sleeves rolled, already talking about the big win she'd hinted at. "A regional bank's ready to replace your most expensive credit line. Half the rate. We just need to move fast." Her certainty should have been comforting. Instead, Ethan found himself watching the way she never quite answered questions directly. When Mason arrived to review the draft agreement, Ethan asked casually, "Who exactly are their backers?" Ava didn't hesitate. "Community-oriented investors. Same philosophy as Build the City." The answer landed too cleanly. Ethan nodded, making a mental note to have someone dig. The rest of the day was a blur of calls. Vendors seemed more receptive, maybe because of Ava's strategy, maybe because they sensed blood in the water and wanted to secure their position before anyone else. By late afternoon, the bank deal was nearly set, pending Ethan's signature. As the office emptied, Mason lingered. "You've got doubts," he said, not as a question. "Dylan thinks Ava's working for Lang," Ethan admitted. Mason didn't react much, just tilted his head. "Wouldn't surprise me. Lang's smart enough to use someone with her credibility. The question is, does her agenda kill you or keep you breathing until he decides otherwise?" Ethan glanced toward the glass-walled room where Ava was packing up. "If she's playing me, then she's doing it well," Mason finished. "And sometimes, that's still the best card you've got." When Ava finally left, Ethan stayed behind, the glow of the city outside casting long reflections on the office floor. He opened his laptop and began searching state corporate registries, digging deeper into Build the City. Each layer took him closer to a familiar set of names, but he stopped short of the final link. Some part of him didn't want proof, not yet. His phone buzzed. Unknown number again, Lang's in town. Meeting at Pier 37, midnight. Ethan stared at it, the cursor blinking in his half-written vendor email. Outside, the river shimmered under the city's lights, dark and restless. Midnight wasn't far off. Pier 37 was the kind of place the city forgot at night. Rusted bollards, the smell of brine and diesel, a wind sharp enough to make eyes water. The only light came from a few sodium lamps buzzing overhead and the distant glow of Manhattan's skyline. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, his coat pulled tight, scanning the empty pier. A black sedan idled at the far end, exhaust curling into the cold air. The driver's face was invisible behind tinted glass. At 11:59, the rear door opened, and Victor Lang stepped out. He looked exactly as Ethan remembered: charcoal overcoat, silk scarf, the faint smirk of a man who believed every meeting was already his to win. "Ethan," Lang said warmly, like they were old friends meeting for drinks. "Glad you came." Ethan kept his hands in his pockets. "You've been busy. Build the City, the bank deal. Ava." Lang's smile widened. "She's impressive, isn't she? Knows how to earn trust, move fast, keep the optics clean. You should thank me for sending her." "She's your employee," Ethan said flatly. "She's my partner," Lang corrected. "But that's not why we're here. You've stabilized, barely. I can take you the rest of the way. Wipe out your remaining debt, inject new capital, relaunch the brand under my network." "And in return?" Lang shrugged, as if the answer were obvious. "Control. Majority stake. You'd still be CEO, of course, public face, creative vision. But the real levers would be in steadier hands." Ethan stared past him at the black water slapping against the pier. "You could have bought Turnstile 2 years ago. Why now?" "Because now," Lang said, "you'll listen." The wind pushed at Ethan's coat, tugging like a hand. Every instinct screamed to walk away. But another voice, colder, quieter, reminded him that survival sometimes meant playing along until you had a better move. "I'll think about it," he said. Lang stepped closer, voice dropping. "Don't take too long. The next wave's coming, and I'd hate to see you drown just as we've got you afloat." The sedan's door opened again. Ava stepped out, hair pulled back, eyes unreadable. She didn't look surprised to see Ethan, almost like she'd been waiting for him. "Ethan," she said softly, "we should talk." But Lang was already sliding back into the car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. The sedan pulled away, taillights shrinking into the dark. Ethan and Ava stood alone under the buzzing lamps, the night air smelling of salt and old metal. "You knew," Ethan said. "I knew you needed saving," she replied. "The rest depends on whether you want it to be me doing the saving or him." The city was still asleep when Ethan got home from the pier. He didn't bother turning on the lights, just dropped his coat over a chair and sat at the counter, Ava's words replaying in his head. "The rest depends on whether you want it to be me doing the saving or him." By sunrise, he'd made coffee he didn't drink and read through the deal papers from both the Queen's lender and the new regional bank Ava had brought in. He traced every line, every clause, searching for the strings. They were there, subtle, hidden in the language. And at the other end of them, Lang. Dylan came by mid-morning. "You look like you haven't slept." "I didn't," Ethan said. "You were right. Ava's tied to him." Dylan leaned against the counter. "So you cut her out?" Ethan shook his head slowly. "Not exactly." At noon, in the war room, Ava was already pacing, phone in hand. We need to close this bank deal today, she said. Any delay and the rates change. Ethan shut the door. No, he said. We close nothing until the terms change. He slid a folder onto the table. Inside, a rewritten deal. No backdoor equity, no transfer rights without my approval. And Lang's name comes off anything connected to this company. Ava studied him for a long moment. You think you can stare him down? I know I can outlast him, Ethan said. And if you want to keep working with me, you'll do it on my terms. Her jaw tightened, but she smiled, small, reluctant. You've grown teeth again. She glanced at the folder. He's not going to like this. Good, Ethan said. If Lang wants control, he'll have to take it in daylight, not shadows. That afternoon, Ethan went live with another video, short, unscripted, and sharper than the first. He spoke directly to customers, vendors, and employees, promising a leaner, cleaner turnstile. No hidden owners, no quiet takeovers. His phone buzzed constantly afterward, half praise, half warnings. By evening, Lang had called twice. Ethan didn't answer. 3 weeks later, the rooftop was gone, the Hamptons share sold, the company slimmer but stable. Ava stayed on, whether out of loyalty or unfinished strategy, Ethan couldn't tell. Maybe both. Dylan visited more often, always bringing the unvarnished truth with him. Ethan knew the storm wasn't over. Lang was still out there, patient as the tide. But for now, Turnstile belonged to him again, and he'd learned something the hard way. Survival wasn't just about keeping your head above water. It was about making sure you weren't swimming towards someone else's net. One night, he stood at his apartment window, looking out at the city lights. The skyline blinked back at him, indifferent but endless. Somewhere out there, Lang was plotting. Somewhere else, Ava was, too. And Ethan? He was ready.